Welcome to this screencast on developing with the Microsoft Graph. Let me first talk a little bit about what this screencast is and what you can expect from it before we start diving into the content. This screencast is going to accompany a hands-on lab and a training module that you can take advantage of that goes along with everything you're going to find in this screencast. Specifically, you're going to find in this screencast is really going to be an example of someone presenting the content from the training module as a way for you to learn how you could use this module and delivering it to a different user group or at a conference. However, you can also use it as self-paced learning. Now, the way that this module is set up is that it's broken up into a series of a couple different sections. We'll go through each one of them in just a few minutes. Each one of these sections is going to finish with a demonstration. Now, the demonstration, we don't walk through the entire step of creating the application or walking through the steps of writing all the code. Instead, we look at the final solution that has already been built and kind of pick through the code and pick through the important parts that you should take advantage of or you need to take note of. And we'll see it working as well. If you want to go through and you want to build the application, you want to see how it's being built, then what we would recommend that you do is go check out the hands-on lab that accompanies this module. Because the hands-on lab, each of the exercises maps to one of the demos inside of this screencast that you're going to see. So if you want to see how to build it and you want to walk through the steps, you can walk through the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module and get to the exact same place that we're showing you here in the screencast. Instead, we're not going to show in the screencast all the individual steps of creating the application. And part of that is because things change on a rapid cadence, and the lab is going to have the most updated steps and dependencies and stuff that you're going to need. The screencast is more or less showing you how the thing works or how the final solution works. So that's how you can learn more about taking advantage of this content and how we've structured this. Let's go ahead and dive into the actual module itself. So in this screencast, we're going to talk about Microsoft Graph Data Connect. And in this first section, I'm going to introduce you to what Graph Data Connect is, understanding the scenarios that it's going to enable, and then we're going to look at how to enable it inside of our application or inside of our Office 365 tenant. Now, let's start by first understanding, well, what's the challenge here? What are customers trying to do? And customers try and do lots of different things here. Maybe they want to build a better CRM. So they want to mine your existing organization for good customer information, or to maybe do like machine learning and analytics and artificial intelligence to give you a health assessment for certain opportunities. Or maybe you want to do stuff around security and fraud, like detecting fraud with productivity and communication information, or mining communications for interaction patterns with users outside the organization. Maybe I want to optimize my organization and provide capabilities to find an expert, or automate knowledge base creation, or understanding resource utilization within your org. Or maybe I want to build and integrate intelligent workflows such as case management or question and answers bot or support and ticket management. All of those things are all different things that customers are trying to do. And they can do a lot of this with the Microsoft Graph, but there's some challenges with this. You know, some of the most interesting things we can do today are all going to be done using data-driven applications. But reasoning and doing analysis, it's going to require doing that over lots of data, big data sets. And it's built, a lot of these scenarios that I just went through are all built by extracting data from Office 365 using the Microsoft Graph. But the Microsoft Graph, that's optimized for simple real-time entity-centric queries. It's not optimized for data access in bulk in Office 365 or data privacy, in the sense that you are really only given consent for like all or nothing kind of consent models. It's not like you get like access to specific fields on a user. You get access to all fields on a user. And the data security and the governance, well, that's really going to be defined by the developer, because once you get the data, it's really up to you for what you do. And what the Graph Data Connect does is it's going to allow you to leverage your data that's inside of Office 365 using the graph, but it's going to allow you to work with your data at scale and have granular consent over certain fields or only certain people's data. And it's also going to enable us to have a lot of security and governance on our applications. And the way it's going to do that is it's going to securely extend our data from Office 365 over to Microsoft Azure, which is going to give us the ability to take advantage of things like the big data stores that we have in Azure and using machine learning and working with big data solutions. It's going to allow us to do a whole lot of stuff with our data, with using services that we have and resources that we have within Microsoft Azure. So what is it? What is Graph Data Connect? Well, what it does is it's creating a new model for data access and hosting applications within the customer's cloud and within the customer's control. It's going to allow developers to build intelligent applications and experiences using Office 365 data and Azure resources. The application access to customer data is going to require explicit customer approval, and the Microsoft Graph is going to remain still the best approach for enabling user-centric task applications. Now, there are some benefits to enterprise customers when it comes to Azure, to Microsoft Graph Data Connect. We're going to be able to have granular access only to specific data sets or fields required for a specific developer's application. So customers can get to review the specific fields and any exclusions that are defined. Data is then also only going to be stored, processed, and accessed within the customer's Azure tenancy. Only data that the customer explicitly approves is shared with the application developer. Now, this is important. The Graph Data Connect will only export data from your Office 365 tenant to the associated Azure tenant. That's how Microsoft is ensuring the security of your data. Now, you can do whatever you want with the data once it gets to that Azure tenant. You can give anybody access to it, you can export it, you can do whatever you want. But Graph Data Connect only supports exporting data from Office 365, an Office 365 tenant, and the associated Azure tenant or Azure subscription as well. Data policy promises hold true at all times, so policies like encryption, auditing, and etc. are all in place when data moves from 365 into Azure. Now, you can also create a developer application that is managed with no effort from the customer. And there's a whole process that Azure enables called managed applications, where you can have an application that you deploy to the Azure store that is installed inside of the customer's Azure subscription. Now, there are some benefits to Graph Data Connect for developers and ISVs. First of all, like I said a minute ago, all application logic, that's going to run inside the customer's sandbox, inside of their Azure subscription. The developer does not need to be trusted with or being liable for the data because it all lives in their tenants. The data layout is going to be also optimized for analytics applications. We can focus on building value rather than trying to coerce a user mode API, such as the Microsoft Graph, into big data and analytics scenarios. Azure Data Services and tools can be leveraged as well, so we can take advantage of the entire Azure stack to give us really powerful solutions. And as I talked about a minute ago as well, you can have a one-click install for your app through the Azure Marketplace or a service catalog that's done through an internal distribution. Then that's going to make things very easy for you to manage. It's all going to live inside the customer's tenant. So this table is just going to compare if I'm using the Microsoft Graph API versus Graph Data Connect. And here we can see differences between the scope and the access patterns, as well as data operations and protection, user consent, admin consent, and different access tools. A couple things I want to highlight here, though, is that when you look at the access tools at the bottom, we're going to take advantage of existing tools inside of Graph Data Connect, such as Azure Data Factory, to pull the data out of Office 365. Now, what kind of scenarios is this going to enable for us? Well, all of our data, if you think about it, lives inside of Office 365, or at least all of our organization data. Data Factory is going to extract that data using the Graph REST API and the Graph Data Connect and pull it into Microsoft Azure. So Graph Data Connect is only going to enforce the only approved request for the data that's made available. So I'm not going to be able to create a request to pull all of the data from my users' calendars in email if the request for the data has not been approved. So there's a whole approval process you're going to have to run through as well. We'll see that in the screencast. All of the data then is then going to be extracted and stored inside of Microsoft Azure. And the two supported places now are the Blob Data Store or Blob Data Storage and Azure Data Lake. Specifically, you're probably going to want to use the V2 of Azure Data Lake. We then can create solutions that leverage the data that is living inside of Azure. So here's some examples of things that you can do. You can engage with your customers in building the better CRM, as we talked about earlier. And this is going to allow you to pull data out of Office 365 and Workplace Analytics and storing it inside of Azure. You'll be able to transform your products, being able to set up things like building intelligent workflows for Office 365 for your business and your industry. You're also going to be able to optimize your organization, maybe doing things like creating a knowledge base or being a way to easily map people to other people that you know that this user has been speaking to this other customer, and it's easier to find that when you can have an application that looks across all those things. And finally, you can streamline operations. You can detect fraud, and you can do productivity and add additional productivity and maybe enhance your communication by using machine learning and artificial intelligence to look at all of your data to detect patterns of things. You can also create insight applications in the enterprise and allowing anyone to develop really cool custom insights using some of this organizational data. So some tools that you already have, we've got Workplace Analytics that is already doing this, or creating custom insight applications to do this. You can even go through and expose some of this data to your business analysts and let them leverage things like Power BI to create self-service data analytics and customizations. And then developers can do really sophisticated stuff by harnessing full artificial intelligence tool suites and frameworks like things like Spark and Kafka and data blocks and Apache Storm and Hadoop, and do really cool things with your data. So you're interested? How do we get started? Well, that's the first thing we have to do is we have to go configure Office 365 in Microsoft Azure. So Office 365 has some requirements. So first of all, you're going to have to first turn this on your Office 365 tenant. And so you're going to find that inside of the Office 365 or Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and then you're going to pick Services and Add-ons, and you need to go enable this. Now, when you do this, you're also going to have to designate a security group that can approve the data extraction requests. So when a request is made to extract data, if that request has not been approved, you're going to have to, that data is not going to be exported. You're going to have to wait until someone has approved that request. And the person making the request can't be the one that approves it. Then you've got Workplace Analytic licenses that are going to have to be assigned to the users who are making these requests. Now, on the Azure side, what are you going to need? Well, you're going to need at least 2 users, and you're going to need one of those is going to have to be a global admin as well. You're also going to need to have an Azure AD application that's going to need to be created and be given access, because we're going to use application security for securing this. So first step is let's get everything all set up. So in this first demo, we're going to go through and set up an Office 365 tenant and Azure tenant for use with Graph Data Connect. Now in this first demo, we're going to do some setup stuff that's going to be required in order for us to demonstrate how to use the Graph Data Connect. Prior to using Graph Data Connect for the very first time, you're going to need to do some stuff to configure, both ensures that some users are set up correctly, and you're going to have to configure your Office 365 tenant. So this is going to involve turning on a service and configuring a security group with permissions to approve the data extraction request that we're going to create with Graph Data Connect. Now, before we do any of that stuff though, we need to make sure that we have a couple different users that are set up with a global administrator role, as these are going to be required. This role is required for users that are going to be creating and approving these requests, because as you would imagine, or as we've talked about in the slides, whenever you turn on a Graph Data Connect job that's going to export all of the data out of your Office 365 subscription, or at least a lot of the data based on what you configure, you need to make sure that the users that are doing this or that are approving it have sufficient access. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to enable a couple users for the global administrator role. So what I'm going to do is I've logged into Azure AD inside of my tenant. Now this is my Azure tenant that is associated with my Office 365 tenant. And what I mean by that is that the directory, if I come over here and go to Azure Active Directory, and I look at the list of, or this directory that we have here, which is this directory you see listed here, this is the same instance or directory that I'm using here over inside of Office 365. And so I can see that if I come over here and I look at users and look at active users, you can see a list of all of my users, and notice that the domain ends in 234. And if I come over here and I look inside of Azure, I'm logged into the tenant that ends in 234 as well. So I have an Azure subscription that has been enabled and that it is associated with the Office 365 tenant. Now, just as a quick little highlight, how did I get this set up? Well, what I did is I had first took my Office 365 subscription that was already set up and configured and everything's all working. I then went to Azure and I said I wanted to create a new subscription. And I used the same login for the global tenant admin for my Office 365 subscription. I used that as the login for my Azure subscription as well. So what I'm going to start with is by selecting users over here in Azure AD. And I'm going to go find a user that I want to manage. So I'm going to take Alex Wilbur here as the user that I want to use. So I'm going to go ahead and select this user, and then I'm going to select directory role over here on the left-hand side. Now, I'm going to add a role assignment. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this add assignment link you see here, and I'm just going to do a search for global. And there's a global administrator. So I'm going to go ahead and check that off and say select. So I now have this user now has the global administrator role. I'm going to repeat this for another user just for kicks right now. And so you can see here that now we have a second user named Megan Bowen that has now been flagged as having the global administrator role. And if we go back, I also have another user when I search for all users here. And I go to Alex Wilbur and I select his directory role, and I also see that he is also listed as a global administrator. So I have two users that are now set up inside of my Azure AD tenant that have the global administrator role. Now the second step we need to do is to configure the Graph Data Connect consent request approver group. So this is going to be a group that's going to be set up in Graph Data Connect, and any user that is in this group has rights to approve data requests. So I'm going to go navigate to my Microsoft admin portal by going to portal.microsoft.com. And then over on the left-hand side, I'm going to go to my groups and then select groups. Now I'm going to add a new group. And this is just going to be called this is a special group that's to be created called a mail-enabled security group. And then the name for this group, I'm going to call this my consent request approvers group. And just to keep it easy, we'll go ahead and just choose the default option that we have that's set right here. Now I'm going to scroll down a little bit and go ahead and select add to go ahead and create the group. And then once this has been created, let's go. So I'm going to filter here by mail-enabled security groups. There's the one we just created, so I'm going to go ahead and select that. And then I'm going to add some members to this. Now I'm going to add the members to this group that we just added as global tenant admins. So I'm going to come over here and let's manage the members. And let's add in, add members. And then I'm going to do a search for Alex. And I'm also going to search for Megan. And hit save. And so now we can see two group members of Alex and Megan. And these are the two that were flagged as global admins, the global admin role within my organization. Now, the next step is going to be to enable Graph Data Connect on my tenant. So now what I'm going to do is come over here and in the admin, I'm going to select show all and come down to settings and services and add-ons. Now under services and add-ons, I'm going to scroll down until I find Graph Data Connect, which you see listed right here, and I'll go ahead and select it. Now I'm going to say I want to turn this on, and then when I scroll down, it's going to say what's the name of the group that can make these, that can approve these data requests. And so I'm going to choose the one that we just created, which is the consent request approvers group that we defined a minute ago. And then we go ahead and select Save Changes. All right, we can see now that that has now been enabled. So we are now good to use Graph Data Connect. And I can just double click or click back into it to make sure it's enabled. And sure enough, it is enabled. So we're in good shape. All right, so that concludes this first setup process. So let's jump back to the slides and let's talk a little bit more about Graph Data Connect and what's involved in creating these different requests. Now in this next section, we're going to look at how we can extract Office 365 data with Graph Data Connect. So I'm going to show you and explain the process for creating a data sync, where all the data is going to go, and then how to go about creating the Azure Data Factory pipeline that's going to pull the data out. And then finally, we're going to approve the data request. So how does this work? Well, we've already talked about some of these scenarios that this is going to enable. So all of our data lives in Office 365. We're going to use Azure Data Factory to extract the data using Graph Data Connect. And then Graph Data Connect is also going to make sure that it's only going to pull data out for requests that are approved for that data. All that data is then stored over in Azure, and then we can create, as a developer, solutions that leverage the data inside of Azure. Now, Azure Data Factory pipelines are used to extract the data from Office 365 to an Azure storage. You're going to use the Office 365 connector to do this. So you're going to create a pipeline and add the data copy activity. Once you've done that, you're then going to run the Data Factory pipeline. Now, the way you do this is you're going to go in and trigger the pipeline to run after you validate and publish all of the stuff associated with that copy data function. Now, there's a lot of pieces to this when you are going to define on the copy data what the source is and what the target is. We'll see that in the demo in just a few minutes. Now, what you have to do is you have to monitor the status to see if there is a pending approval request. Now, when you see these approval data requests that are out there, you're going to use the Exchange Online PowerShell to check and approve the data request. That's one option. Alternatively, you can use the Microsoft 365 admin center, and there's a dedicated URL that you can go to do this. Now, if you choose to use Exchange Online, you're going to have to log in using the Exchange Online PowerShell with an account that meets the following requirements. The member has to be, that's going to do the approval, has to be in the designated approvers group for Graph Data Connect. We did that in the first demo. They have to have multi-factor auth, has to be turned on, and it has to be not be the same user who initiated the request. So how do you approve these requests? Well, here's what it looks like. So I've got an admin request from the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. You can see these requests are in here. Now I've approved both of these. If you want to do it through using Exchange Online, this is what the PowerShell looks like to go about connecting to it. So you need to make sure you have the Exchange Online PowerShell installed. And then using the Exchange Online PowerShell, you can get a list of all of the data requests that are out there. Now, once it's been approved, so once I approve it, I can use PowerShell to do that. I'm then going to go back to the Azure Data Factory pipelines, and I can see the current running activity, and I'm going to be able to see the status of it, and shows that it's actually going through and extracting data. Now, this can take some time to pull that data out. So we're going to jump over and look at a demo on how to go about creating the pipeline, creating the request, approving the request, and then seeing the pipeline start exporting data inside of this next demo. All right, in this demo, what we're going to see is how to go about creating, executing, and approving a Azure Data Factory pipeline that is going to extract data from Office 365 to an Azure storage blob that we can then do something with that data. And that's what we're going to see in the last demo. So this demo is really all about Graph Data Connect. It's setting up the resources that we need in Azure that's going to execute the Graph Data Connect request to extract data from Office 365, storing it over in Azure. But we're also going to see how we can use the Azure Data Factory to pull that data out, and then also how we can go through the approval request process to make sure that these requests are going to be okay. Now, the first thing that we need to do before we do anything is going to be to create a place that we're going to store or an application that we're going to use for our app for all the authentication that we're going to need. So I'm going to go over here to Azure Active Directory, and I'm going to select the app registrations, and then I'm going to select a new registration. So now this new registration, what are we going to call this app? Let's just call it the Microsoft Graph Data Connect Data Transfer app. And I'm only going to allow access to people inside of this directory. I'm not going to be able to let this be used outside of this directory or as Microsoft accounts. We only care about this using within our organization. So I'm going to go ahead and click register here, and I'm just going to leave everything else that was the default. Now, this app ID is something that we're going to need later. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this, and let me open up Notepad and just paste this in somewhere so we can use this later. So if I remember, we're going to make this the app or the client ID, but then we also are going to need the directory/tenant ID. So let's go and go grab that tenant ID as well, because we're going to need that later as well. So go ahead and paste that in. Now that that's done, let's come over here into certificates and secrets. And I'm going to create a new secret. So I'm going to come over here and create new secret. We'll just call this my 1 year secret and hit add, and we'll let it create it. Now, when this goes ahead and creates this secret, I'm going to come down here and copy this secret out, and I want to store it. Let's do the app secret. We'll store that over here because we're going to use this later inside of Notepad. Now, the duration of it doesn't matter how long it was. Just keep in mind that you want to make sure and keep track of, when your certificates are going to expire. Now, for this application, let's come over here to the owners, and let's make sure that the person that we want to be able to own this app is listed correctly. So I'm going to say that we have an owner here of admin, and one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to, we'll just leave it as is. I want to make sure that the owners, whoever is going to be the one that's going to create the Azure Data Factory, the pipeline request, is the one that's listed here. Actually, just to be safe, let's go ahead and let's add another one. Let's add in Megan. So Megan's the one that was a global admin that we added the global admin role earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and save her and add her as an owner for this as well. Now that we have an Azure AD app created for our process that's going to do the export and run all of the Graph Data Connect information and use it to connect to both Office 365 and to resources in Azure where we're going to store the data that's being extracted, the next step is to create a place in Azure where the data is going to actually be stored. Because the data is going to come out of Office 365 using Graph Data Connect, it's going to be placed inside of some sort of a storage container over inside of our associated Azure subscription. And in our case, that associated Azure subscription is the one that we're in right now. So what I'm going to do, now that I'm still logged into Azure with my global tenant admin account, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and create another resource. So I'm going to say create a resource, and it's going to ask me what kind of a resource do we want to create. So I'm going to come down here and choose storage. And at the top, I'm just going to choose a normal storage account. There's nothing special here. Now, I'm going to have to answer a couple questions here. So where do we want to create this? Now, if I have multiple Azure subscriptions, I could choose different subscriptions here. And in this case, in my little demo, I've only got one called a pay-as-you-go. A resource group, we don't have any resource groups defined. So I'm just going to create a new one called Graph Data Connect. Make it easy to find later. So that, let's see, create new Graph Data Connect. There we go. So that's going to get created. Now a little bit farther down, it's going to ask us for like the storage account name. So, what do I want to use here for this? So I'm going to choose like say Graph Data Connect, and I'll just call it Graph Data Connect dump. Now this has to be unique to our organization, or it has to be unique to all of Azure. So you can't reuse this and say. You can't use Graph Data Connect dump because we've used that in the past. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this unique to my tenant, and I'm going to do that by just putting on the name of my directory at the beginning of it, and it wants everything to be lowercase here. So I just have the same name as my Azure AD directory and my Office 365 tenant, and then I put GDC dump on the end of it. You can make this name whatever you want to call it. I'm just going to leave it as this for right now to make it very clear, as I don't think anybody else is going to use this either, so it'll make life a little bit easier for everybody else. The location doesn't really matter. That's where East US is the default for me, so I'll go ahead and choose that. Performance is standard. That's just fine. The account kind, we're going to use storage v2. That works, general purpose. Replication, we don't need to do anything special here. You can do special replication that you want to use. I'm just going to leave it as the default in this case. And then the access tier, I'm going to leave that as hot. So then I'm going to go over here and click Review and Create. It's going to show me all the settings that we just specified. And we can hear it pass verification. So then I'll go ahead and click Create. And let it go ahead and create this resource. Now this is just going to take a second, but we do need to let this finish. So we'll see the deployment in process, and we just wait on this page, and it'll eventually tell us when the deployment has completed. And once it completes, then we have a little bit more work that we need to do. So through the magic of video editing, we're going to go ahead and skip ahead. All right, here we can see that the deployment is complete, so we're in good shape. So now the next thing we need to do is if I come over to go to this resource, I need to go over here to Access Control IAM. And now what this is going to be is we're going to grant access to the Azure AD app that we created previously. I'm going to grant access to this to our application. So I'm going to select Add, and I'm going to add a role assignment. Now what I want to do is I want to grant the Azure AD app that we created previously, I want to grant it to this storage blob data contributor role. So the role is going to be the storage blob data contributor. And I need to find the account that we had created previously. So we called this the Microsoft Graph Data Connect. There we go. We called it the Data Connect Transfer. So that's what we wanted to create here. So I'll go ahead and select that role and grant that role access to this blob. Now that that's done, now that we've granted access to the application, so that now that Azure AD app is going to be able to connect and log in to this account. And what's nice about this is I don't have to use username and passwords. I'm actually using a real service principal to do that work. Now, inside the storage account, the next thing I have to do is I'm going to need to create a container where I want the data to be stored. So I'm going to come over here to the overview and I'm going to select blobs. And then I'm going to add a container and I'm just going to call this my mail dump. And I'm going to leave the access level set to private, no anonymous access. So this is where all of our mail is going to end up going. All right, now that this is done, we've got an Azure AD app that's been created. We've got a storage location where all the data is going to go. We've granted the Azure AD app access to that storage dump or to that storage blob where all of our mail is going to go. The next step is to create an Azure Data Factory pipeline, because the pipeline is what's going to be used to actually do the work of pulling the data out. So what I need to do is come over here and say, I want to create a resource, and we're going to do a search for Data Factory. So I'm going to create a new instance of Azure Data Factory, and I'm going to do the same thing we did last time where we use the prefix of the resource for the name, because this has to be unique, and then I'll choose Data Factory like this. Now, resource group, let's use an existing one, and specifically let's use that one Graph Data Connect that we created previously. And the version is v2 and location is US. That's fine as well, East US. Now, again, the resource group does not matter. That is whatever you want to choose here. I'm just leaving it in the same place where we created the storage account previously. So I'm going to let this resource get created because it's going to need to be created in order for us to actually use it. So through the magic of video editing, I'm going to skip ahead to when this resource has finally been created and is ready for use. All right, here we can see that the deployment was successful. So now if I come over here to my resource groups, if I go to my Graph Data Connect resource, you'll now see all of our resources in this resource group. So we have our storage account and we have our Azure Data Factory v2 as well. So I'm going to select the Data Factory. And then I'm going to select Author and Monitor. And what this is going to do is it's going to open up the Azure Data Factory full screen editor where we can create our pipeline. Okay, now that we've set up with this default view here, let me go ahead and open up the navigation pane so you can see a little bit more of what's going on. I'm going to choose Author over here to jump to the Author experience for creating a new Azure Data Factory pipeline. Now, by default, Azure Data Factory is going to use an integration runtime that is going to auto-resolve for the region that you're currently in. So as Graph Data Connect requires that your source and destination and your integration runtime is all going to exist in the same region as your Office 365 tenants region, it's recommended that you're going to create a new integration runtime with a fixed region. And so what we want to do, if I come over here and I have connections set, you can see I have integration runtimes and we have this auto resolve. What I'm going to do is I'm going to choose new. I'm going to say perform data movement and dispatch activities to external computers. So I'll go ahead and select this and hit next. I'm going to select Azure as my region here, and then I'll select next. I'm going to give it a name for a runtime, so we'll just leave it as integration runtime 1. The description, I could choose anything I want here, but I'm not going to worry about that. And then in this case, on the region, instead of it going for auto resolve, I'm going to say East US. And this is going to make sure that I'm using the same region as where my my Office 365 tenant is, as well as my Azure storage account. Make sure everything is going to be running in the exact same region. And then I'm going to go ahead and click Finish. Now, the next step is to create a new pipeline. So I'm going to come over here to my pipelines. Go ahead and close this. Come over here to my pipelines, click plus, and say I want to create a new pipeline, as we had no pipelines currently selected. So now we can go ahead and start hiding some of this to give us a little bit more real estate in the UI. So the activity I'm going to want to use here, I'm going to create a new activity or use a new activity called copy data. So I'm going to just drag it over here into the design surface. Now, once that's done, I'm going to select this activity so that the details of it are going to show up down here at the bottom. And what I want to do is go to the source for our activity. I'm going to come over here and select new because I don't have any data sources that are defined yet. So I'm going to create a new source, and the source that I'm going to choose is Office 365. It says Office 365, but in reality, this is really Graph Data Connect behind the scenes. So then I'll say continue. Now, this designer, what it does, creates a new tab that you see here for an Office 365 connector. So what I want to do is come over here to the connection tab for this, and I'm going to select new because we don't have anything listed. So I'll say new. And in this dialog that's going to appear, I'm going to enter in the previously created Azure AD applications ID and password in the service principal key details that you see right here. So there's the service principal ID. Service principal, that is the app ID that we created previously. So I'll copy that and paste it in. And then this principal key, I want to grab this key right here, copy it, and paste it in as well. And then I'll go ahead and click Finish. So that's going to go ahead, that has now created a connection over to our tenant because that has access to to Office 365. Now, in the table field over here, I got to choose what do I want to use here. And so on this side here, I'm going to choose the basic dataset v1 message. So it goes basic dataset v1 message right there. Manage. We want message. Now there's another setting that you have to set, and it's right down here at the bottom. And I'm having a little bit of trouble here with my screen real estate in this screen recording. And so I'm going to do a little trick here. And what I'm going to do is just hit Control minus. And what that's doing is I'm really just coming over here and I'm zooming out a little bit where you can see I can choose the date filter here where I can define a filter that I want to set. So what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to select for the column name, I'm going to choose the create date time as the date for my email. And then the start time here, I'm going to choose, let's go back. I'm going to come back to December 1st of 2018. And the end time, I'm going to make that say June the 1st of 2019. Now I'm going to come over here to Schema, and under the Schema tab, I'm going to choose Import Schema. Now, within the source that's been configured for my copy data activity, I now want to configure the schema or the sync. And this is where all the data is going to end up going. So once I've imported the schema, we're in good shape. But now the next thing I want to do is I want to import or copy all the data that's coming in here. So what I want to do is I'm going to come back over here and select on my pipeline, come back over here, go back to my pipeline and select the data, or the copy data activity, and come over here to my sync because the source is now all configured based on all the steps that you saw me do just a minute ago. Now we don't have a place where we're dumping everything. So now what I do is create a new data sync. Now this is going to be the Azure Storage Blob that we created previously. You see there's three different options. We've got Storage Blob, Data Lake Storage V1, and Data Lake Storage V2, or Gen 1 and G2. We created a Storage Blob. So I'm going to select Storage Blob and click Continue. Now for the format of the data, I'm going to choose JSON, and then I'll click Continue. And then on the connection tab, so we've got our new blob set up. Now I'm going to leave general as is. I could change the name if I wanted, but I'm just going to go straight to the connection tab. Now for the link service, I don't have a service that's been set up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on New, and I want to put in the following values in here to be able to connect to it. So what we're going to do is for the authentication method, I'm going to change this to a service principal because remember we're using a Azure AD account, which is a service principal. So for the subscription, I'll leave this as select all. I could use the one that we had just created here. So that's the same as the Azure sub that we had, subscription we were working with a minute ago. In this case here, I'll leave it as select all because that includes the same one. The storage account that we can use, well, there's the Azure storage account that we had created. Make the screen a little bit bigger here now that we're out of that. We didn't have a problem with the screen real estate. We have our tenant. That's the tenant for our Office 365 and Azure tenant, that the ones that are linked to each other. And we can confirm that where you see it ends in 5371. And if I look over here in Notepad, we can see it ends in 5371. Notice it's going to want the principal ID and the principal key. Well, we've already seen those before, so we're going to grab this right here and put the principal key like that, or the ID right there, and we'll take the secret and we'll put that right here. And once that's all finished, you can test the connection if you like. I'm going to go ahead and click finish because I know it all works. Okay, there we go. Now we're back to the same settings. Let me back up a little bit so we can see all the options that we have at the bottom. Now, next to the file path option right here, I'm going to select browse, and I want to choose the mail dump option for the container that we had previously created. So I'll go ahead and select finish from there. And on the file format option that you see down here, I'm going to change this to set the pattern equal to set JSON format and the file pattern to an array or a set of objects. So it's going to be a JSON set of objects. So now everything looks like we're in pretty good shape. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over here and click validate all. And what this is going to do is this is going to look at our entire pipeline and make sure that everything's fine. So in this case here, you see everything is fine. So once that's done, I'll then close this out and I'm going to say publish all. So what that's going to do is that's going to publish my storage sync, it's going to be publish my source, and it's going to publish my pipeline. So these are all three artifacts here, and you saw, if you were watching up here in the top right corner, that everything was created and we're in good shape. So we've got two data sets. We got where the data is coming from. Make this bigger again. We have where the data is coming from, where the data is going to in our blob, and then the pipeline is what's using both of these two things. Now, with the pipeline it's been created, the next thing we want to do is I want to go ahead and execute it. Now, this can take quite a few minutes for this to actually show up. So it's not uncommon for this entire process that you're about to start can take over 40 minutes. So you're going to just need to be patient with this. So in the Data Factory Designer, with the pipeline open, so we have the pipeline open right here, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to select add a trigger, and it's going to ask me, do I want to create a new trigger or trigger now? So we're going to do this manually, but you can see you can create some sort of event if you want to be triggered at a certain time. So trigger now, this is going to go through and it's going to run, it's going to trigger the pipeline. So I'm going to go ahead and say finish. So this is what's going to start the trigger using the configuration. Now, once I've started this, you just saw that a little notice here popped up, but we can see that the pipeline is now running. What you can do is you can come over here into the navigation and select monitor. And this is where you can go see the pipeline to see any running jobs that are going. Let's close this out. So here we can see that it's now in progress and my job is actually running that we had just created. And it's been going for about 15 seconds now. Now let's locate the one that we have selected or that we had started, which of course is this one we just created. And then underneath actions, there's this option here where I can see view activity runs. So I'm going to go ahead and select view activity runs. And on the screen, you're going to see a list of all the activities that are currently running on this pipeline. Now, our pipeline only has one activity, so you should only see one that's listed as in progress. Here, it's still initializing, so we're still getting to the point where it's actually starting to spin up. So here, you just need to wait for just a minute and wait for this to get until we're in the in process stage. Okay, now you see that we're at the part here where the state is set to consent pending. So what does that mean? If I come over here and I select these little eyeglasses to choose details, to see the details on this, notice that it shows here that consent is pending. And now what that means is that inside of the Graph Data Connect infrastructure, that while we've created a request to extract this data and we were logged in as our global tenant admin, the administrator for the tenant, we have to have someone actually approve this request. And it can't be the same person that created the request here. So at this point, the activity run is internally, it's paused until someone manually approves this consent request. Now there's a couple different ways you can do this. You can either do this through PowerShell using Exchange Online, or you can use it using the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. And I'm going to do it more in the UI way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a new window, and we're going to log into portal.microsoft.com. So here we're going to log in as Alex W. So remember we created Alex W earlier. He was going to be my user that we're going to use for as a global admin that we were going to use for to approve the request. So I'm going to go ahead and log in as Alex. Let me go grab Alex's password and paste it in. That's not correct. Didn't grab the right password. There we go. Now, the user that's going to be approving the request has to have multi-factor authentication, or MFA, enabled on their account. And in this case, I do have that set up for Alex. And so what I need to do is grab the code that was just texted to my phone number, and I need to type it in. Now, this is a requirement for Graph Data Connect. You have to have multi-factor authentication turned on the user that is going to be doing the request, that's going to be approving the request. So let's get rid of all this. And what we're then going to do is let's come over inside of the Microsoft Admin Portal. Okay, now that I've logged in through the Microsoft Admin Center, the Microsoft 365 Admin Center as Alex, I then need to go to the page where we're going to be doing our approving the different requests. Now, initially, the URL that we need to go to, or the link that the page we need to get to for approving these data requests, is not showing up in the navigation. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to paste in the URL to the /settings/privileged access link to get to the page that has all the requests that are currently present. So here what this is going to do is it's going to show me a list of all the requests that are out here. So you can see that we have a data access request. This data access request was requested by the administrator at this time, and it's now currently in pending state. So I'm going to select it. I'm going to scroll down a little bit, and I'm going to select approve the request. So now we can see it's been approved. So now that that's done, I can close the browser that we were just in, and we should see in just a minute, we should start to see this request should change, the state should change in a minute from consent pending to it should now start pulling data out. So now we can just come over here and we just refresh this page every few minutes or every few seconds, and we should see consent pending change to something else that indicates that it's going to start extracting the data. So through the power of video editing, we're going to cut out the wait that we have. I'm just going to jump ahead to the location, the time of when it's starting to extract data. Okay, here you can see that the status has changed and it now says it's extracting data. As I said, this process can take some time. It took some time for the Azure Data Factory to note that the pipeline request or the data extraction request had succeeded or had been approved. And so now it is going to proceed and start exporting all of that data as it was requested. Now, this process can take some time. It can take some time, and it really depends on how long it's going to take. It's going to depend on how much data you're exporting from your Office 365 tenant. So right now, you just want to take a step back, let this process complete to where it exports all the data to our Azure Storage blob, and we will pick up with the demo once we've done that, once that has happened, and we'll see all the data, take a look at all the data that's inside of the container within our storage blob. So for now, let's just take a little bit of a break, and through the magic of video editing, I'm going to cut out the wait time so that we can move on with the demo and the screencast. Here you can see our Azure Data Factory pipeline job for Graph Data Connect has completed. It succeeded in its export, and it took about 55 minutes to export all the data. So this is what the status would look like. If I come over here and close this, we can see that when we were on our monitor, we went from our monitor page, and from our monitor page, I looked at all the pipelines and selected our pipeline 1 and looked at the activity that we ran. And you can see here that we can have our status is set to succeeded. And to confirm we got some data out, to see that we got some data out of here, what I'm going to do is come over here to my Azure portal. And if I go to the resource group that we had created for our Graph Data Connect, and I go to the storage account, and then from the storage account, if I go to the blobs, and then look at the mail dump container, I should see some data showing up. Well, sure enough, I do see some data showing up inside of our container. So great, so this now shows that we successfully were able to create, configure our Office 365 tenant, configure a couple different users, and then we went in and we were able to create a data factory pipeline and export some data out using Graph Data Connect. So in the last step, in the last demo, you'll see how we can actually use some of this data that we've exported. Now in this last section, let's talk about how we can leverage some of this data that we've pulled out. So what kind of scenarios are available to us, and then how we can create applications that leverage it. So what kinds of enabling scenarios does this support? We've already talked a little bit about this. Remember, data resides in Office 365, and we use Azure Data Factory to extract the data using Graph Data Connect, which is also going to ensure that only approved requests are going to run. All that extracted data is going to be stored inside of Azure, and then we can create custom solutions that leverage that data in Azure. Now, one of the ways you can do this is by creating something called an Azure Managed Application. Now, this makes sense if you're a third-party dev or if you're an ISV. If you're doing all this stuff internally to your organization, this might not be necessary. The benefit here is that I can, as a developer, as a third-party developer, I can build an application that's going to live and run in Azure, and then I can deploy it to the Azure store as a managed app. Then what my customer can do is they can then go install the application from the Azure store, and it will then install that app inside of their Azure tenant. So they maintain all control over the app and the data. You can learn more about it from the link that you see there. Now, this is advantageous because remember, Graph Data Connect is only going to put data that it extracts from Office 365 into the it's only going to put it into the Azure subscription that's associated with that Office 365 subscription. So that part's key and important. So what we're going to do is I'm going to see how we can take an application that can process the extracted data from Office 365 with Graph Data Connect. Now in this sample here, we've already got the project that's been built, and I just want to show you how it's working with all this data. We're not going through the process of doing the managed app. Instead, we're going to take the scenario that I'm an internal developer for, let's say, Contoso, and I've already created the request to get data out of my Contoso Office 365 tenant, stored it in my Contoso Azure subscription, and then I'm going to deploy an app in Azure that's going to run and have access to that data. So let's see what that looks like. Now, in the previous sections, you've seen how we could configure and set up our Office 365 tenant for Graph Data Connect, and also configure users in the proper way that we need in order to use these users in the scenario of working with Graph Data Connect. We've also seen how to use Azure Data Factory to create a pipeline that was going to be used to export data from our Office 365 subscription. Specifically, we pulled out data from our, email data from our tenant, and we stored it in an Azure storage blob. Now in this last step, it's always, now that I have the data out, what can we actually do with that data? And the possibilities here are really endless, as we talked about in the last few slides. We can do anything we want with this data. And what we've done in this screencast here is I've simply created a very simple ASP.NET MVC web application that is going to use and process the data that we have. Now it does it in a very, very simple way. What we're going to do is we're going to look at all the email that was exported from our application, and I'm simply going to show that data and process it and look and see how many users are getting emails that are sent to them, or how many times they've sent email out, or all the emails that are sent across the organization, how many times their email address has popped up. So just kind of giving me a little bit of telemetry type stuff. If you are interested in seeing how to go about building this application, go check out the training module that is associated with this screencast. And in there you will find not only this final code sample, but you will also find a step-by-step how-to hands-on lab that walks you through the entire process. In addition, there's also exercises that demonstrate the other demos that I've done as well. So I'm just going to walk you through this existing application instead of building it from scratch. Now, one of the things I did here is we're using a connected service, or the Azure Storage Connected Service. And when we do that, we have to specify the connection information. And so here underneath the web config for our application, what I've done is I've had to specify the account name and the account key for my application. And where I found these inside of the Azure account. So if I come over here to, again, my Graph Data Connect resource group that I had created previously, and I go to my storage account, the storage account has a name, and that's the account name that you see right here at the top. That's the name of my storage account. I also needed to get access keys for this, or specifically one access key. And so here I grabbed this access key, either access key 2 or access key 1, and that's what I pasted in for the account name that you see right there. There's our tenant GDC dump, and the account key is the key that we just looked at. So what else does the code for this application do? So what I've got here is I created a model, and it's called an email metric. And all this is just got an email address, and then it's going to have a number for all the recipients that were emailed. I then created a controller here called my email metrics controller. And so inside of this controller, let's look at the code and see what this does. So what this does is I have a method here that's called process blob emails. And what this method does is it goes through and is provided in a cloud blob. So that's like our the JSON set that was created for our for the export, and then a collection of the email metrics that we just defined a minute ago. So what this is going to do is it's going to walk through every single line inside of that blob. It reads out the JSON object, and then it pulls out of it the email address of where it was sent to. And then what it does is it looks at all the to recipients in the email, the CC recipients, and the BCC recipients. And it takes all of those numbers and it adds them up as the total recipients for that one email. And it goes through and does this for that email over and over and over and over and over, or at least for all the emails inside that file. It then goes through and it's going to say, well, let's create a new email metric. And I'm going to create an email metric for this specific email address. And I'm going to go through and add up all the recipients that were sent, that this email address sent emails to. So if it was going to be looking at my email address, it would look at all the people that I've sent email to that was exported over the time frame that we defined in the Azure pipeline. I check to see, do I already have this user? Have I already processed their email? So let's say, for instance, it was looking at it, it found the email address a second time in a separate export. And if it did, then it just updates their number. Otherwise, it's going to go ahead and add them to my collection. All right, and these email metrics that are being passed in, I'm simply going to be referencing this going over and over and over. Now, once that's done, let's come down here and let's look at this next method. It says process blob files. So what this does is I'm creating a connection or information about the storage account, and then I'm connecting to that blob. So I'm connecting to the blob using the storage client. And then from the storage client, I'm saying get a reference to that container, which is the mail dump container that we created. And then over here in the code, I'm saying go list out all the blobs. And that's where I'm going to walk through all of the blobs, which is just basically JSON files. And every time I get a blob, I'm going to process all of those messages, all those email messages. And that's where that's being called. So it's going through and processing all these different blob files. Now, if I come up to the top here, what you'll see is I have an action that I've defined called show metrics. So that's an endpoint that I want to go to. That's going to go through and process all the blobs, and then it adds that to my view model. And then I've just got a standard ASP.NET view over here for my show metrics. And what that'll do is that's simply going to write out a list of all the emails and all of the recipients that they've connected to. So as I showed you in the last demo, I can see if I go over here to this storage account and I look at the blobs. I look at the blobs right here, and then I go to the mail dump container, and we can see I've got a whole bunch of blobs that are showing up for different emails. So what I'll do now is come back over to my Visual Studio ASP.NET MVC web app, and let's go ahead and run our app and take a look at it. Here we go. We want to go here, and I'm going to go to email metrics. So now when I click view email metrics, that's what's going to go process all those blobs. Now, this is a sample code and a sample demo application. So if I had exported gigs and gigs of data, it would take a lot of time to process all of the emails that we had extracted. But I only have a handful of people in my little test demo tenant. Of course, this is just showing you how you could use the data, but exactly how you plan on using the data, well, there's tons and tons of options here. But again, I'm just going to go ahead and click View Email Metrics, and that's going to go process all the data inside that container. And so what do we get? Well, we can see all these email addresses that we're listing out that we found inside of our organization and the number of emails that they sent to. So we can see that Lee G sent emails to 87 different people. Okay? So it's a really basic example here, really simple code example that just kind of walks through some JSON data. There's nothing special about this code that you see here that is Graph Data Connect specific, because all Graph Data Connect is really doing is extracting this data that we can then process inside of our tenant, or inside of with our own custom code, however we see fit. Now we've reached the end of this screencast for this module. You've seen a lot about how to do development with the Microsoft Graph based on the topic that we've covered here. Keep in mind that everything you saw here inside the screencast accompanies a training module where you can find slides and hands-on labs and all the final solutions that we showed you in the demos inside this screencast. So if you want to learn more, I recommend you check out the module associated with this screencast. Again, if you remember, the demonstrations that we showed you in this screencast, they don't walk you through every single step of building the application. Rather, we just look at the final solution that we've built and we see it running, which you can expect to see. If you want to see how to go about building a solution just like this, go look at the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module, because each of the demos corresponds with a specific exercise from the hands-on lab. So we have steps where you can walk through each one of these things. Again, one of the reasons we don't do all of the individual steps in the screencast is because things change on a very rapid cadence in this new cloud world, and different dependencies change, version numbers change, maybe a couple steps in screen caps are going to change as well in the hands-on lab. And so we keep the hands-on labs updated every couple months. But the videos would get out of date really quick if we tried to do that. So to save a little bit of time, we've just showed you the final solution, and we maintain the hands-on labs that you can take advantage of. I hope you got a lot out of this. There are a lot of other training modules associated with the Microsoft Graph that I'd recommend that you definitely take a look at. We've also got a couple additional links here that are at the end of the slides in the training module where you could use to learn more about this technology. So again, hope you got a lot out of this and you enjoyed this screencast. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch it.